Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to day 2 of our wonderful conference. How are you? Where are you joining us from today? Please let us know where you're joining us from. Pop a little note in the chat. So, what have we got in store for you today? You really want to know, don't you? Okay. Actually, before we get into that, let's do some highlights. Let's share some highlights from day 1. And again, if you'd like to, you can pop your highlights. Most sparkly moments from day 1 in the chat. For me, what were my highlights? I would like to say that Dr. and Iman Zahid's term misery really stood out for me. The work of Grevio, the Istanbul Convention and its articles that essentially serve to mandate its ratified members on their implementation of domestic violence prevention, combating domestic violence, and the stance that it's a violation of a woman's human rights. That's powerful and should not be accepted. Another thing that really stood out for me yesterday, again from Dr. Nodi's presentation, was the P's. I don't know if you can recall the P's that she referred to, which were preventing, protecting, prosecuting, and policy, but in particular, integrated policies. Now, for day 2, we have presentations. We again will have a number of Q&A sessions and workshops. It's another very, very exciting day. And I ask you, I encourage you, I challenge you to remain just as connected as you did yesterday. It's important for us to be present in the moment and set aside some of our day pressures associated with our jobs. Use the chat again to post your highlights, your comments, and any reflections. Another thing I'd like to ask you to do is complete the feedback forms. And where can the feedback forms be found? The feedback forms can be found on the screen below the chat box. If it would be very, very helpful for us if you complete your feedback forms prior to the workshop commencing. And you only have to complete the feedback form once. So one feedback form for the 2-day conference. Your feedback is very, very important to us. So please take a few moments to provide that, to share that with us. Coming up for day 2, we have presentations. The first presentation that will be coming up at 9:30 will be around work with perpetrators from specific cultural communities, specifically South Asian community. Thereafter, we will have another presentation, which will be about working with perpetrators from Polish backgrounds. Thereafter, we'll have audience Q&A, and then we will move into Zoom in the late morning for awareness raising workshops. So, are you ready? I hope that you're ready, that you're excited. I hope that you're all posting lots of exciting comments on your reflections and what you hope to get out of the day ahead. But for now, I would like to introduce and give a very, very warm introduction and welcome to Dean Adjuković. And he is the chair of the board of WWP.
Good morning and welcome to our second day of the WWP conference. I welcome you on behalf of the organizer of the Work with Perpetrators European Network. And we are excited to have so many interested people that have attended our day 1. There were at least 165 people who were at any time plugged into our conference. They came from 25 countries. And today, we expect about the same number. This is one of the advantages, of course, of the online conferencing, because otherwise we would not be able to have so many people actively engaged in our program. The very rich program of the second day is bringing a new format in our conferences, and this is the awareness rising workshops. These are 1-hour workshops that highlight some of the issues that are closely related to our topic, that is migration and barriers to perpetrator work. So I invite you to choose one of those and attend. Likewise, we will have more traditional workshops, 4 of them in the afternoon. And for myself, it was very difficult to choose which one to enter and participate. So I invite you to these exciting events. We are living in difficult times of COVID pandemic. We are struggling with waves of ups and downs. And that reflects also the perpetrator work. As you may know, WWP has actively engaged in providing guidance, or at least ideas about how to work in the difficult times of the pandemic, with restricted possibilities to directly communicate or work with perpetrators. And that has proven very helpful, as we know from feedback from many of our countries. And many of our members. Let's hope that a year from now, we will be able to maintain our traditional format of face-to-face conferencing, maybe a hybrid one, because this new challenge has brought also some new opportunities on how to do and how to deal with and use the technologies that traditionally we would not have used for meetings like that. And here comes a reminder for the WWP members. I remind you that we will have our annual general meeting on October 13. It will be online. And it is especially important because we will have the board elections. And I ask all the members to please email Antonia, our lovely Antonia, until October 5th to confirm the attendance. That is very important. That enables the members of WWP to actively take a role in governing our organization. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our next session. As NG has already said, we have 2 presentations on working with perpetrators from specific culture communities. And we are starting with the first one, which is a presentation on working with South Asian communities by Kate Iwi, Dilshana Hassan and Ranu Khatun, who come from the Positive Change Services in the UK. Please enjoy the presentation and our program today.
Hello, so I'm Kate Iwi and I'm here with my colleagues Dilshana Hassan and Ranu Khatun, and we all work with the Positive Change Service in London, UK. And the reason that we are talking to you today about working with South Asian communities and particularly doing perpetrator work with them is because it is different working with different communities. There's widespread recognition that around the world, the figures for domestic abuse are variable depending on women's financial emancipation in different countries. And if you look at this World Health Organization map, you can see by the size of the circles that, you know, the figures are high in Bangladesh and South Asia. In Bangladesh, we're looking at about 2/3 of women experiencing domestic violence, as compared to about 1/3 in the UK across their lifetime. And in Tower Hamlets, we've got a very significantly South Asian community. The vast majority of them, so we've got about 89% of school children are from a minority ethnic group, and the vast majority are from the Bangladeshi community. So importantly, I want to say we're not talking about a community as if it was homogenous. I think it's important to recognise we all fit into our cultural norms in very different ways. We fit them in some ways and we completely push against them in other ways. Also significant that the community we have here in Tower Hamlets aren't really a migrant community. Most of them have been here for 2 or 3 generations and they're very well established. And the word migrant has a bit of a pejorative feel to it here in the UK. On the whole, if they were a white English-speaking community, they'd be called expats rather than migrants. And we ourselves, I guess we prefer to think of them as a diaspora or resettled community. Our programme is very much adapted to work in the community setting where we are. So we offer group work and individual work, all of our different services, either in Bangladeshi, Bengali language or in English. So, so we've adapted both the way we work, but very particularly we have workers who speak and work in Bengali. We're going to talk you through some of the things we think that it's useful to know about in order to work well with this population. We're going to go through a little bit about their reasons for turning up in the UK and settling here. We're going to talk about family life, marriages, gender, arguments that are common, and about the context of racism and Islamophobia in which our communities are living, and we're doing this work. So I'm going to hand over to Dilshana to start us off.
There are clear expectations in Bangladeshi community and Bangladeshi life about what a role of a man is and what a role of a woman is. And so usually men are expected to provide financially. In order to provide financially, a lot of the times the family would spend all their savings to send the man, the boy, to another country, for example, places like UK or US, to be able to provide or have a better life, or have the option to provide a better life for the rest of the family. So when out of the usual norm and understanding of their role, the man has to adapt to a culture very different to his own, with the added pressure not to fail, as it would bring a lot of shame to his community, to his family. So keeping that in mind, at times when a man is living in this country, he may have his own children and his own wife over here, which he also has to provide for. However, he has to, and they may be living in, for that reason, to be able to provide for the family over here and over there. It turns out a lot of the times the family living with him, his wife and children, may be living in a lot of poverty and overcrowding situation, just so that he is able to manage in sending and providing for the family in Bangladesh.
I suppose also one of the other interesting aspects of that is because it's not sort of war or torture or trauma reasons for migration, that actually we're not so much working with those kinds of areas of extreme PTSD and trauma, but we are working with quite significantly traditional patriarchal expectations.
Yeah, it's worth remembering that Bangladeshi families come from a very close-knit community, and often the values and norms that they carry have been carried over generations. And one of those norms is how they see marriages. Marriages are often arranged or approved by the elders in the family. Okay, and marriages can be also seen as an informal contract between two families, possibly to strengthen prior relations, or possibly for one family to kind of a way out of poverty. Okay, if there is a difference in terms of wealth in between the two families. So the relationship is very much, it's not just about the couple itself, but it has a wider impact on the extended family, and so therefore it's very important that this marriage works. Okay, if it fails, then there's implications to the wider family, such as honor, family honor, such as possible future marriage proposal for the children, or even other extended family members. So there's a lot of pressure from both sides, women, the husband side as well as the wife side, for this marriage to be successful, because it then creates a status within their community that the family are doing well, they're it creates a different level of status for them. So what happens when there's domestic violence and abuse in that relationship? Well, it's not an easy decision for a couple to separate when that happens, because there will be additional pressure from the extended family, from both sides, to stay together, because there's a genuine belief that parents staying together is better for the children, better for their future, and therefore, abuse may often get overlooked or silenced to make the marriage work. Okay.
Yes. I've often heard people say, we don't, when I've called up to invite someone in for a first meeting, oh no, the problem's gone now, she's apologized for calling the police, as if the problem was the calling of the police rather than the violence. Yeah.
Yes, rather than violence, rather than what actually caused for the victim to call the police. And it is quite a normal practice culturally for the woman to move in with the husband's family, in the husband's family home, even if it's for a short period of time, and therefore adapting to his family's norms and behaviors. So putting the in-laws first, their needs first, her husband's needs first, and that could create sometimes abuse within the extended family. Okay, so that could create not an equal role for the woman. She might be expected to do a lot of domesticated tasks such as cooking and cleaning, and that could then put some pressure on the marriage itself and cause a lot of conflict within themselves, particularly if she's from the UK and been brought up to expect more, want more, have ambitious, want to learn, so therefore not be restrained to just being at home as a housewife. But some families may deliberately choose to get their sons married in Bangladesh, for example, purely because they believe that if they get their sons married to somebody who may be in poverty or maybe a lot more have a lot more less income, then she will come over, adapt to their family, and not know what her rights are in the UK, and she'll be a lot more submissive, a lot more malleable, a lot more kind of and able to be controlled. So that also opens up to abuse.
Marriage is almost always an arranged affair and takes place when the parents, particularly the father, decides that a child should be married. In the acceptable setting, family would choose the bride and the man would go back to Bangladesh with family, marry her and bring her back over here. The expectation remains mutual in this setting. Man works, children are raised within the extended family and learn early that individual desires are secondary to the needs of the family group. Following orders is expected based on age. An adult or older child's command must be obeyed as a sign of respect. Culture falls primarily on household women and their daughters, and boys have more latitude of movement outside the household. There has been some changes in the marriage side of it. Usually older divorcees marrying younger men has been seen as not a favorable thing, but younger men are marrying divorced women with British citizenship. Younger men who have been brought up in Bangladesh with certain family values and expectation are suddenly moving here to a ready-made family. Older children, a woman, older, mature woman who's had a married life, who's experienced a lifestyle here. So this in itself brings a lot of challenges. They're not following in accordance to how he knows how children behave. He doesn't know how to relate with them. And these itself brings a lot of challenge.
And I think it's really significant that women get so blamed if it's definitely the women who carry off the stigma if the relationship breaks down. So for a woman to leave a first marriage within the Bangladeshi community is just about doable. It's not very common, but to manage to leave a second one is like, feels almost unrecoverable. And as a result, someone's second husband seems to be able to get away with anything, you know. That
you're absolutely right, Kay. It's almost the woman almost feels it's impossible for her to actually come out of an abusive situation or a very sad marriage situation. We have seen a number of times where if a woman does speak out about the second marriage being unhappy, the blame is immediately put upon the woman that she is a failure. She'll be made to feel like a failure by the community, by her own family at times, that you couldn't make the first marriage work and now you're not making the second marriage work. And so she's obliged, and without that support, she feels that she needs to remain in this marriage. And also coming to the financial side of it as well. You know, at times we will see that the single mom with children, she may be working and she may have some financial independence, but as soon as this younger husband from Bangladesh comes along, he may not have a good job, or he may not have the qualifications to get the job, but the expectation would still rely on him to provide for maybe family back home. So then more pressure is added to the to his wife to financially support him, as well as him having not having maybe access to work here. So these things add even huger pressure in a domestic setting. I pass it over to Ranu in terms of gender. You could explain further on that side.
In terms of, so I'll talk a bit about gender related issues. And so often men in Bangladeshi communities are the main breadwinners. Women take on more of a domestic role and the lead in parenting the children. In Islam, women can earn their own income and control their own income, and there is no need to share that income with their husbands. And the husbands are responsible for providing the women and the children. However, in Bangladesh, culture plays a big role in people's beliefs, and therefore culture and religion are quite entwined, and in practice often they follow culture rather than religion. And so therefore often women are expected to depend on men's income, husband's income solely, so not encouraged to have their own income or work. And often there's a lot of expectation for women to put their in-laws, their husband's needs over and above theirs. Okay, so for example, in Bangladesh, it is quite a norm for fathers to keep the children post-separation. That's not out of the norm in Bangladesh. Whereas in the UK, post-separation, often children remain with the mothers. And fathers often seize in all responsibility of their parenting role post-separation. Co-parenting post-separation is a newish concept in the Bangladeshi community. It's something that a lot of couples struggle with and don't really have much of a guidance within the community, within the family structure. And this is when they need professional support in terms of working out the ins and outs of contact, in terms of sharing, financial responsibility, taking an active role as a parent, and not just having contact for certain time for a certain amount. So in second marriages, often when an older woman is marrying a younger man, and he might be marrying her for other alternative reasons, for example, immigration status or something, they are coming into a relationship with this woman who has other children, prior children, possibly older children in their teenagers, and expected to be this ready-made fathers when they've not actually become a father of their, haven't become fathers themselves. And that can cause a lot of conflict. We are finding that, parental conflict often comes from disagreements about how the children should be brought up, the men feeling totally out of their skill set to manage this. And also there is expectation for women to generally meet the needs of their husbands, whether that's emotionally, sexually. It's almost like it's expected them to be able to meet their husband's sexual needs regardless of whether they are wanting to be intimate at that moment or not. And it's not norm to show affection as a married couple openly in the community or openly within the family. It's almost like this is something that happens in private. So affection, anything such as kissing, hugging, so normal things that normal type of affection that you would see generally in the Western communities. That's something that is meant to be in private, without an audience. I guess I can pass on to Kate about some of the other less.
It may not surprise the audience as a result that some of the really a lot of the work that we're doing around domestic abuse, when we look in at what the arguments are about, they have a different shape than in any given community. And in the Bangladeshi community and in most diaspora communities, there are a lot of arguments about who sends what money home to their family. And how much the family are weighted against the family here, the households with wife and children compared to extended family back home. But also going on from what both of you have said, this rivalry, this managing the tensions when a man is sat between his own mother pulling one way and his partner, his wife, pulling another way. So those rivalries between mother-in-laws and wives. Sexual pressure is a really significant area to work on because of this expectation that marriage gives you, huge sexual entitlement as a man. And also because within the Bangladeshi community, this is not a very much discussed area. So when we talk about this in perpetrator groups, it's very often the first time any of our clients have had a sort of serious conversation with other adults about sex. Also, there are a lot of arguments about the issue of women reporting abuse. As I mentioned before, that can lead to huge resentments in the future. As you were saying, Ranu, raising children between two cultures, very tricky. There's a lot of issues that are around hostility to the other person's family, an extended family. Your family is not good enough, your family don't like me, these kinds of things lead to, because the family is so involved.
Yeah, I find that sometimes the conflict doesn't remain just between the husband and wife, it extends into both families and then becomes very personal and hurtful, and often that could take a long time to recover. And people can hold grudges. Both families can hold grudges on the basis of what's been said and done in the past.
Absolutely. And on the other hand, just to say that we notice lower levels, not zero, but lower levels of arguing about substance abuse, particularly around mothers, the woman's substance abuse. Doesn't come up that much at all. And sexual jealousy, especially sexual jealousy of the woman, comes up a lot less also. So different shapes of arguments. And Dilshana, I think you were going to talk a little bit about what it's like for Bangladeshi people living in the UK right now.
Yes, at the moment, one of the things that we've come across is now we could see there's a lot of cultural difference between a European understanding of culture to Bangladeshi understanding of culture. And then there's the language barrier as well. And putting all that to in the basket with the fact that if there is a problem that comes into the woman's life and she wants to report it and needs to come out of it, the added pressure of the community and the family is huge. And then not being able to communicate with the professionals, not being understood, or being judged for being a Muslim woman, that in itself brings a huge challenge. So at times, women, even if they want to come out of that situation, even if they want to say, help me, get me out, there's so many barriers that they have to jump over. The barrier of being a Bangladeshi woman, the barrier of being a Muslim woman, the fact that they don't know if what they're going to say, the professionals would understand them or even take them seriously enough. So all of that added pressure stops us from knowing the amount of domestic violence and abuse that does occur in those kind of settings.
So Dilshana, just let's think a bit about how we deal with all that. Just talk a bit about our sort of the ways we deal with the language issues in groups, would you just explain?
So in positive change, one of the things we found was in order to get the clients to connect and understand the session, it's vital there is good communication. So positive change has a Bengali group, facilitators speak the same language. This helps for the clients to engage, interact, and discuss in the groups. This also helps to challenge and talk about DVA from a cultural and religious concept. There are certain words, for example, which don't translate well in Bengali. So in those kind of situations, especially in Sylheti, which is majority of our clients. So in those kind of settings, we, rather than just saying the word, it has to be very descriptive and is more discussion based and described for them to understand.
Yeah, I guess one of the things we do is we try and understand how that particular family, that particular culture works and what's important to them. So it's very important to understand that Bangladeshi families do not operate as a nuclear family. Okay, they are part of a wider family. So it's important to understand what's important for them, for their family, what responsibilities they might hold. That goes beyond their wife and children. And how is that responsibility managed? How is that pressure acknowledged or managed at all? And often when there are difficulties within the family, before any professionals get to find out, often the elders in the family will try and get together and resolve the issues. Sometimes the issues that they are trying to resolve is something they don't understand, because the conflicts can be about two different generations, about Western views to their traditional views, and the elders who try to help the young couple are from the first settlers, the first generation of settlers in the UK. So they might not necessarily understand what the young couple are seeing as an issue themselves. So it's important to understand that there's a difference in generations, and their set of values about relationship is also different. The second generation is want to adapt, to be more modern, want a career, want to learn new things, whereas the first generation is very settled in their way that they've brought their values over and want to protect that, want to keep that. It provides them a guidance, in a sense, of life. Whereas the second generation is about, they're looking for different guidance. They're trying to move away from that. So you've got two norms in the working against each other. So sometimes it's important to acknowledge that, are the elders in the family able to support this young couple in their conflicts, or is it that it's creating more conflict because they're not able to do that? So it's about seeing whether they need something separate. Some second generation couple prefer not to use anybody from the community or they want to keep their family difficulties as quite private, quite not to be kind of a public knowledge within the community. So it's very important to understand which strand is most dear to that couple. One of the other things we can do, we worked with imams, we worked with community leaders, we use our family group conferencing, the module that's practicing in the UK, which is part of this child protection system, a way of getting their extended families to become more of an upstander rather than a bystander when there's abuse, kind of hold the perpetrator accountable and support the victim. and not look the other way, and actually skilling the extended family to do that is something that they need support in, because this is something that they might not be able to do on their own. Do you want to add something, Kate?
I'm just going to say about in group work, actually with the perpetrators, we need to think a lot about our adaptations are often about the examples we use. You know, in group work in the UK, we dramatise a lot of or give scenarios of arguments. We think that, like, learning to deal better and with arguments and de-escalate involves practice. So we quite often set up scenarios people can practice with. It's a bit like riding a bike. You can't just do it on a theoretical level. And the practice scenarios need to be culturally realistic and relevant. So there'd be no point in having a scenario where, you know, Miriam comes back from the pub really drunk and Mohammed is angry that she's so late. It would really be jarring for our clients. So there's something about choosing our source scenarios. When we do very theoretical pieces, we often video them in well, I don't, but Dilshana and Ranu will video them in Bengali so that they can be played as sort of explanatory pieces of video. And even when we're talking about imaginary couples, you know, whereas it used to be we'd often use the names, I don't know, Jack and somebody, British names, we're mindful into Hamlets to use names that can fit in both cultures. So like Daniel and Mo and Ruby, and there's certain names, not all that many, that are common in both South Asian and British language. So
yeah,
those kinds of things.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Kate, it's also important to help the perpetrator and the family to kind of have some sort of script that they can agree on, and kind of, because it's important, they struggle to often, because the Bangladeshi community is quite a close-knit community, that, you know, when there are difficulties within the family, it's likely that their neighbors might know about it or hear about it or heard something about it. And, you know, it's so important for them to feel comfortable to say something without disclosing what the issues are, but feel comfortable to have an answer to some of the questions that they might be faced with in the community or from the extended family. And I found that, you know, that's something they stress a lot around, they argue a lot about, because they might not agree on what to say on, and so helping them to come up with some sort of script about how they can address these questions in the wider community does help.
And I mean, we're so pushed for time, but we thought it was important to just say a word or two about what we do when perpetrators come to our service and make particular religious and or cultural justifications for their abuse, you know, and it might be like, you know, hitting is acceptable in my religion, or men are entitled to sex whenever they want it in my religion or culture. Or yeah. So let's talk a little bit how we respond to that.
In terms of where it's first of all, it's about having some knowledge and understanding about the religious side. So a lot of the men we work with, being Bangladeshi men, tend to be from Muslim background, and at times they would use Islam out of context to justify their behavior. So as mentioned, you know, saying things like, oh no, it says it's okay for a man to hit a wife. So we would take it back to them thinking about what they've said, and as facilitators would talk about what the Quran says about the role of a man And the role of a man is to be the provider, the carer, show respect and love and affection as a husband, as a father. So that's one of the ways we would show it from a religious perspective. But the other way we would say is, okay, tell us where in Quran this is stated, or tell us where you got the quote from, and have a wider dialogue. But and generally men tend to we just tend to explain to them that they need to look at things on a basis of being, even if looking at it Islamically, what Islam says about being good human beings. And so that's the first part. Second part, at times it's about them confusing culture and religion, and so they would put their culture, beliefs and expectation entwined into religion. So it's about challenging their beliefs. So we do CBT work with them to understand about what is belief, where does it actually come from? Is it more culture or is it more religion? So for them to explore that side as well, and to challenge themselves.
Yeah, and I think I'm just going to add just something very small. Sometimes it's also acknowledge, I mean, that's when your knowledge base comes into practice, is pointing out to the perpetrators that, you know, there's sometimes they're choosing to kind of drop some of the more important pillars of Islam and focusing on things that it kind of validates their behavior. And, you know, sometimes you've got to point that out. You know, there are other important pillars of Islam that they mostly ain't practicing, ain't following. And why do they choose to kind of specifically focus on this part, or misunderstand or take things out of context because it's their behavior, or because it validates their behavior?
And I have to say, I've never come across any religion or culture that actively approves of or encourages domestic violence. And I kind of, when people tell me, oh, you know, what I do is acceptable in my community or religion, I'll ask them, so have you told everybody at the temple or the mosque or the church about what you've done? And if not, why not? What do you imagine might be their response? Like, you know, if it's perfectly acceptable, and begin to look at actually the sort of disentangle the idea that, you know, a religion may not actively stop them. It may turn a bit of a blind eye, but it really isn't going to be telling them they have to be violent to a partner. And if their religion isn't telling them to do it or to stop doing it by their, you know, by their version of that, there are plenty of other reasons to stop being violent, you know. And you know, myself, I'm not a person of faith, and I can find many reasons not to be violent based on kindness, children's needs and interests, having a nice relationship with my partner and in my family. So so there's also something important about coming back to those more human kind of values that cut across faiths and communities, and looking at what the other reasons are to stop the harm. And I see where. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kate, Ranu and Dilshana from the Positive Change Service. That was, for me, and I'm sure for you, you will all agree, that was a very culturally insightful presentation that gave us lots of good practice in terms of how to work with families that feature domestic violence in their intimate relationships. I think there's a lot to take away from that. So next, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to Stephen Madill Ania Tajsiak from Domestic Abuse Services in Edinburgh, and they're going to provide us with an overview of the work that they do as part of the Respect Project. Welcome.
Hi, my name is Stephen Madill. I'm a senior social worker with the City of Edinburgh Council, and manage the Respect Polish project, and I've been working with Perpetrator programmes and support services for the partners for just a bit over 25 years.
Hello everyone, my name is Ania Tajsiak. I'm a group worker within the Respect project at City of Edinburgh Council. So I work with Polish men who come to the project, and when they get to the group part of our work, together with my colleagues, I lead the group sessions. And occasionally I also do some one-to-one work with men when necessary.
Okay, thanks Anya. So I'm just going to start off today's presentation. We're talking about the work that we do with Polish perpetrators of domestic abuse in Edinburgh. And so what we're hoping to do in a fairly short order is give you an outline of the Respect project and what our approach is to working with families who have been affected by domestic abuse in Scotland. Anya's going to lead a discussion or a presentation around the cultural and historical context of Poland and Polish migration, and how that impacts on how Polish men in particular might engage with services. And we're also going to look at what issues might get in the way of migrants or people from minority ethnic groups engaging with support organisations, and indeed with statutory organisations like ourselves or children and families social work. So, in terms of Respect is a project that was funded by the Scottish Government. We set up, we probably started taking referrals towards the end of 2013. And it was really a response to the fact that police were aware that after English-speaking white men, Scottish men, the next biggest group in terms of perpetrators of domestic abuse that they were aware of were Polish men. And they were concerned also about the quite high levels of violence involved. At the same time, I was aware from children and families social work that there were concerns about how they were not able to engage particularly well with Polish families where there was domestic abuse, and there were concerns about the safety of children. And so as a consequence of that, the Scottish Government actually put out a request for funding in December of 2012, and we put in a bid specifically for a service around domestic abuse to work with Polish men. And that was a successful bid, and the service started towards the end of the following year, as I think I mentioned before. So what we do is we work with men who've acknowledged abusive or controlling behaviour towards their partners. But crucially, we also offer a service to the partners or ex-partners of those men, and a service towards their children. Now that is because we became aware in terms of our work with perpetrators long before the police, that it was not safe to do this if we were not also providing an advice and safety plan for the partners or ex-partners. So while we didn't know that the Respect model would be exactly the same as our mainstream model, that was an important part of it from the start. But in addition, we do provide some short-term partners proved to not be suitable for the programme, where either his risk are high, well, where they're both high. So we try and do that if we have the capacity to do so. And we also work very closely with other third sector organisations, including some who provide services primarily or solely to the Polish community. So in the next slide, we'll say a bit about what we do. So actually it's the same as the mainstream service that we offer now, in that it's we work with men who have acknowledged abusive behaviour towards an intimate partner, and they can come to us on a voluntary basis, or because they've been mandated by a court to come. But for both categories, they need to show concern about their behaviour and a willingness to address it. So I suppose what we do is the journey of the men, which is towards taking greater responsibility for their behaviour, becoming more accountable, and talking about that and using the support of the workers in the one-to-one sessions, and then the other men in the group, to try and make substantial and long-term changes in their behaviour. Through that time that the man is with us, their partner will be offered a service which is entirely up to her if she wants to use it. But that can be about safety planning, it can be about support, it can be simply about explaining in general terms the work that we do with abusive men. And children can also either be worked with individually, or they can be referred on to other agencies such as CEDAR, which works with children in a group setting who have lived with and are recovering from domestic abuse. It's absolutely essential that we work with men and women in their first language, so the service is provided by Polish-speaking social workers. And on some occasions we do some motivational work with men who've got pending court matters, but that is very limited because we don't want them to influence. We don't want any work that we do with them to influence the outcome of the court. I.e., our preference is always for men to be on a court-mandated order if they're convicted of domestic abuse offences. So, next slide says a wee bit more. Often, as I mentioned earlier, I think the children with family social work, they're now called children's practice teams, really struggle to engage with Polish families, and Anya's going to talk about why that has been and why that might still be. So I'm not going to engage in that. But what we do with the men as well as with the women is to try and ensure that their voice is heard in the process, but also that men are, to some extent, also it's about them being held to account to the fact that they are fathers, because quite often in days gone by, the men were ignored. We also provide consultation to other agencies, and that can be about what other special services there might be around. It might be about how to use translators, but often it's about the same as for our mainstream service, which is how can they best strike up a relationship with men or with the mothers, and provide a service for them. So it's quite wide ranging, but generally we encourage other agencies to pick up the phone, and we'll do our best to help with any queries that they have. We also do training, which is specifically around how to engage with Polish men who are domestically abusive, but we would also include some elements of what we do with the mainstream service, because often it's, you know, when workers are hearing men being very defensive or matter of fact about their behaviour, it's quite hard to think about how do I engage motivationally with this man rather than feel anger at what workers are actually hearing. And the other thing we do a lot of is briefing sessions around projects, around the project and about aspects of Polish history and culture. And again, that is included in what Anya's, a lot of what we do there is also in Anya's bit of the presentation. So next slide is about what we don't do. I think this is because quite often there are issues around people may be reluctant to use interpreters, or they think that the respite workers have got a very good relationship with the man or the woman, will just ask them to do the interpretation work. That's not what they're there for. and it shouldn't. Sometimes I think where decisions are being communicated to men or women that might be difficult to hear, it should actually be that agency who's making those decisions who has that conversation, rather than asking us to do it for them. And yeah, again, sometimes we get asked to do things that are not our task and that actually limit how much the workers can do of the tasks that are their priorities, because other agencies assume, well, they can do that, and it won't involve having to have a translator. So moving forward, referrals generally come from the children's practice teams, so that's the social work teams that are involved with children who may be at risk or who may have particular needs, or who might be at risk of coming into care. Yes, so EDACS is the Edinburgh Domestic Abuse Court Service, I think is what it stands for, and this is basically available to all women whose partners are charged with offences, so we do work quite closely with them as well. And obviously our referrals come from the court. We have a fair number of men who self-refer, but within that, there's quite a few of those who've been encouraged to refer themselves by the children's practice teams. And we also, for those men who are being assessed, and it might take a few weeks for that assessment to happen, we can provide short-term support for women if they're at high risk, particularly if there are no other agencies involved with this woman, but it might be about doing some safety planning and then trying to signpost women on to other services. And the next slide. I'm not sure how much people are able to see of this, so I'll read through it. We use what's called an integrated intervention model, and it recognises that if we're going to keep women and children safe from domestic abuse, that we need to address the man's risks, but also what strengths there might be there in terms of helping him to change. We need to look at the vulnerabilities that might be there for the women and or the children. And we also need to work in a multi-agency way where everyone has the same understanding and uses the same language around domestic abuse. So that's what we mean by the integrated service. So we want to try and address the man's risks, but also build on any strengths they may have, help the women to keep themselves safe, and to also make informed decisions about their relationship, although we would not be telling them whether to leave or stay in a relationship. That's for the women. And also to make sure that children's voices are heard within the system, and making sure that agencies have the same understanding, that they speak the same language, and that we try and avoid what we call service-generated risk, where that lack of communication or poor communication or lack of understanding can lead sometimes to increased risk inadvertently. And the next slide is where I hand over to Ania.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Now we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of what our usual information sessions about Poland would look like. So it's a quick snapshot of a history of the culture of Poland and how it impacts the way Polish communities are perceiving domestic abuse. So Poland is a fairly large country in Central Eastern Europe, quite highly populated, and fairly homogeneous. In the census from 2011, most of people in Poland declare themselves as Roman Catholics, and it's not ethnically diverse. 98% of population declares themselves as Polish. That has not always been the case, and Poland used to be a very diverse country. but through the world wars and extermination and forceful resettlement, it became fairly homogeneous. Also, importantly, it's also changing. So we are seeing much more inwards migration to Poland from other countries for education and for economical opportunities. So it would be really interesting to see results of the most recent census, which took place this year, to see how this has changed. In terms of geography, what's important is that Poland does not have natural geographical borders on its end. So willingly or not, Poland has been in the center of many violent conflicts over the centuries. So the history of armed conflict and quite high presence of violence in history and in communities is something that the country has been affected by for many centuries. So with regards to the history, Poland, after centuries of successful ruling within Europe, has been split by 3 countries at the end of the 18th century. It only regained independence at the end of the First World War in 1919, and it has entered 20 years of very unsettled and fragile period. This has been followed by the Second World War, which was 6 years of violence, extermination, concentration camps, and forceful displacement. After the Second World War, the country, which was significantly damaged, has entered between the 1945 and 1989 a period under communist ruling. But it was under, as I mentioned, communist regime. So what it was known for, it was a poverty, a lack of services and structures, very dysfunctional models and coping mechanisms that people apply to be able to cope through that period. And also quite high level of control from the state over the nation. So that period has caused a lot of mistrust in the authority in Poland. So any public services such as police, social work, NHS are not really highly valued as reliable and respected in Poland. The last kind of period in the history is the democracy, which started in the early 90s. So the country is slowly building its structures, but the development of democracy is still in progress, and the kind of unsettling politics are not really helping to build more of a social trust towards authorities and services and public support. The history that I've mentioned has an impact on the culture and tradition that we see in Poland. So most importantly, we would want to mention some of the gender roles that are having an impact on our communities. So there are very distinct and strongly reinforced roles that men and women should fulfill, and they are rooted in the tradition but have very strong impact on day-to-day lives. So the role of a woman, which we would want to mention, is so-called Polish mother, or as you would say in Polish, Matka Polka. So the role model of a woman is a woman who's sacrificing her dreams, ambitions, and her rights, and finds fulfillment within looking after her family. So she strives for perfection, and she makes sure that her children are looked after, well fed, the husband is well presented, and her house is spotless. At the same time, she's presenting very well, and she maintains this very good overview of her household publicly. So what it means in context of the domestic abuse, very often women would not want to present any issues that are happening within their family, because that would be seen as their failure as a mother. So if there is a domestic abuse or domestic violence, women would take a blame for it. Obviously, there is a lot of women who are pursuing their careers and their rights and their entitlements, but that to some extent is still seen as selfish, and women are often perceived as ungrateful if they're not really fulfilling the kind of main role model that is reinforced. With regards to the gender role of a stereotypical man in Poland, it's a noble person who strives for success and perfection. He is very hardworking, and he's a breadwinner who provides for his whole family. He's also very resourceful and is able to find solution to any issues. Sometimes, finding the solution and finding the resolution would result in use of violence or physical force, but that would be accepted. He's also known for withholding his emotions, as talking and expressing emotions would be seen as weakness. And quite famously, Polish men are known for drinking a lot of alcohol as a kind of coping mechanism. Another aspect of the typical Polish man, he really values patriotic values, such as God and honor and his fatherland. So this kind of very noble presentation and kind of values are really seen as something that is really appreciated amongst the community. So obviously those gender roles are quite stereotypical, and obviously there is an increasing diversity in the way that men and women are finding themselves working within, and existing within the communities. However, those kind of two stereotypical roles are something that we go back very often to, as we do see those elements amongst men and women that we work with. What's also worth mentioning is the influence of the Catholic Church on Polish communities. As I mentioned before, most of Polish people declare themselves as Catholics. And within the Roman Catholic Church, a family is highly valued. So that comes with the stigma of divorce, and very often if you would be seeing a level of domestic abuse within the family, that would be still accepted, and females would be sacrificing themselves to preserve the holy union of a marriage. The influence of Catholic Church also plays a role with regards to women's rights and some of the reproductive rights of women in Poland. So those traditionals and values are really feeding into understanding of abuse, which in Poland is slightly different to the understanding of domestic abuse that we see in Scotland. So first and foremost, in Poland, domestic abuse would be very much seen as domestic violence, as a physical violence. So a lot of behaviors such as controlling or coercive control would not be perceived as domestic abuse, and therefore it would be highly unreported and not really taken into consideration when we're talking about domestic abuse in Poland. So as I've already started to talk about the understanding of domestic abuse in Poland, until the age of 80s, domestic abuse in itself was not really recognized as a separate issue, was not really discussed as a separate issue in that context. From the 90s, there has been some public campaigns which have increased the understanding of domestic abuse and have promoted some of the support networks that women and children can access if they are victims of domestic abuse. However, very strongly, domestic abuse within the family is still perceived as a family matter and is highly unreported. So people would very often not report domestic abuse in their own families as well as in the neighboring families if they've witnessed any. And just to close up, we want to refer to the 2015 survey around violence against women. So there is a dispute in Poland until today whether domestic abuse is an issue within the specific community and specific nation, or whether it's actually something that is not necessarily more prevalent than in other nations. So the survey from 2015 shows that the prevalence of domestic abuse in Poland is not necessarily exceeding UK or the average of European Union, quite the opposite. Very many countries which took part in the survey would have reported a higher prevalence of domestic abuse. This survey is very frequently quoted as an example of the fact that Poland does not really have a significant issue with the use of violence in relationships. However, as I've mentioned before, looking at the understanding of domestic abuse in Poland, it is recognized that domestic abuse in Poland is highly underreported. Very often professionals would not necessarily understand the definition, would not recognize warning signs or certain behaviors. Again, because the domestic abuse is perceived as a family matter, it would very often remain within the family, and the witnesses of domestic abuse would not necessarily report it to the public. And just to give you kind of a flavor, there is mixed feelings and mixed attitudes towards domestic abuse in Poland. So on one hand, we have a saying that women should be respected, they should not even be hit with a flower. But at the same time, there is quite a common Polish saying which refers to the fact that women should be beaten if this is something that is for her health. So even in the kind of common day-to-day language, we are seeing conflicting attitudes. And I think that's a kind of good summary that there are definitely conflicting attitudes with regards to domestic abuse in Poland, and it's something that should continue to be explored. The last part of our presentation today is a brief talk about barriers for Polish families and professionals. So something that you might be interested in when you engage with Polish families. And the first one to begin with is the language barrier. This is something that isn't unique to Polish community. It would be something that you would have to be aware of when you're working, and you probably are aware of when you're working with any minority who does not have the common language as their first language. The benefit of our project is that all of the workers that engage with Polish families are Polish speakers. So we deliver the program and we communicate with our clients in their first language, so in Polish, which does allow to build relationship much easier and does allow to build trust with our client group. It also helps to manage the dynamic of having a third person in the room when you have an interpreter, and also cuts out some of the inconsistencies when you have interpretation involved. What we're also seeing is that Polish people are really keen to get involved with us, and it's much more they're much more comfortable, and it's much easier for them to be able to express themselves when they talk about very sensitive matter such as trauma or domestic abuse. So as I said, this barrier is not necessarily unique to Polish community, and you would be aware of that when you're working with ethnic minorities, you do need to use an interpreter, even when a person appears to be communicating well in the given language. It's always good to ask if they would like an interpreter present, because they might have a really good grasp of common day-to-day language, but they might lack vocabulary or confidence to talk about really sensitive matters. And also when we're talking about domestic abuse, we are very often talk about legal aspects of people's lives as well, and the legal language tends to be very confusing even in your first language. So we do make sure that people are understanding what are the core proceedings that they're going through. Also, a very important aspect of language barrier is making sure we do not use family members as interpreters, and that there is an independent interpreter who can help us with interpretation. Stephen, did you want to come in?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say there are a huge number of issues around the use of interpreters. We could do a workshop on that, but obviously we don't have time. But I think it is worth being aware of what those issues can be, and there can be, a variety, a wide variation, either in terms of competence or in terms of people's understanding of domestic abuse. So I mean, a lot of this stuff will be interesting to people working well beyond Polish families, but anyone from minority ethnic groups or whose first language isn't English. And it is maybe about having a chat with the interpreter. We've certainly built up good relationships with particular interpreters who are keen to understand about domestic abuse. So it's worth thinking about how you might do that, how you might have even just a 10-minute conversation with the interpreter before you start a meeting to explain a wee bit about domestic abuse, or how what you're going to cover, or what the issues might be that come up.
Thanks, Stephen. And one more recommendation that we always have when we talk about language barrier is to encourage people to attend, in our case, English as additional language classes. So encourage, especially victims of domestic abuse, to engage and learn English, as this is something that is going to give them the agency. We are also seeing, working with our families, that the ability or inability of speaking English becomes a tool for perpetrators of domestic abuse, and they do control their partners by not allowing them to attend ESOL classes and learning English. So empowering people and encouraging them and giving them opportunities to learn English does always help, not necessarily only with engagement with services, but also rebuilding the confidence. So another aspect is communication. You would be aware and mindful that different languages have and different nationalities have different cultural nuances to the way they communicate. And being aware of those might help you to engage with clients. With regards to Polish community, we are much more direct in our communication. So when we engage with services, Polish clients are often being perceived as rude, where it's just the way we would be expressing ourselves. Another example is us using titles. So Polish, in Polish, we would use titles Mr. and Miss. And then we might feel uncomfortable when we engage with somebody who's in the authority figure, but addresses us with our first name and ask, to use the first name instead of the title Mr. and Miss. Stephen, on to you.
So I was going to add something around what you were saying about communication, and I think what those people have said to me, I think it's true. There's a lot more that, in terms of politeness, that is around a tone of voice, but that is quite easily missed. Although I think in general terms, I would say that in British society and Scottish society, we're one of the most polite and indirect communicating cultures in the world, and so I think what Ania said will probably hold to some extent for most other minority ethnic groups. In the terms of the differences in the social system, the law and legislation, again, I mean, it's something that Ania has touched on, but it mingles also with the kind of political differences. So I suppose there's not only what Ania's talked about, which is maybe anxiety or mistrust or fear of agencies, state agencies, which may well be based on direct experience, is not understanding what the law is. And I suppose if you can imagine yourself moving to another country with a completely different legal system, different set of values, and not speaking the language, what would the impact of that be on you seeking help? Or if somebody picked up concerns about your children and suddenly these state agencies were engaged, in addition to how that must feel for any parent in a country that they're familiar with, how is that going to impact on their level of honesty with agencies and their ability to engage? And I think sometimes that's a big part of the work that we do, and a big part of what is appreciated by our colleagues in children's services is our ability to try and demystify that, to debunk some actual quite strongly held myths. I'm not putting myself, I'll start that again. To debunk some myths that have grown up and have gone around the Polish community about what social work services and children's services in particular will do. So this is a major barrier to parents' engagement, but it's also a major barrier to us as professionals providing a fair and equitable service to people in the Polish community or the wider communities where they don't understand the system or necessarily speak the language. And I suppose all of that you can put onto the fourth thing there, which is is isolation, which is why, as Anya was saying, there is that, we would always try and give folk opportunities to learn language, particularly women, because quite often their partners are actively trying to stop her doing that, because he's quite happy for her to be isolated. And learning the language is a huge step in terms of being able to move past that isolation and to make relationships with other people, to engage with services. And so I think that isolation, I don't know, Anya, would you like to say some more about how that impacts on folk?
I think what I would add to what you said, Stephen, is that isolation plays a huge part for any minority. And with regards to the Polish community, we are seeing quite a lot of people who have had to leave behind some lives that they've built before, and they have still family members that would not be available for their support immediately. So the support network that people have is much more limited. And also there is a certain level of stigma associated for people with people who moved abroad, and there's expectations that they are successful and they are earning a lot of money. So it's really difficult to admit that there are any difficulties after you moved abroad. So people might feel extremely isolated if they do not have the relationship with their families that they had in the past, and they do not have the network available to them locally.
Should maybe add as well the impact of both Brexit and COVID in terms of, quite often for a lot of the women that we work with, they've had support, regular support from their parents, their mothers often coming across to support them. And that's just not been an option for many of them because of COVID, and also ongoing. I think Brexit is going to have an impact on that as well. I think we probably have to wrap up at this point. So hopefully you'll have some questions for us in the next wee while. And these are our details. If you need to contact us to find out anything else, we're very happy. I mean, Anya doesn't work with us. She works very part-time, so I would say for emails, either email myself or the Respect email address at the bottom. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen and Anya of Respect. Some really, really interesting and insightful work that you're doing there. So now we're going to transition to our Q&A. The chat is busy. I have your questions. So I'm now going to invite Stephen, Anya, Dilshana, Kate, and Ranu. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. So let's go. The first question I have is from Anna. And this is a question to you all. How did you make the decision to start working with the Bangladeshi or Polish community? What were your first steps when starting the work?
I mean, I can certainly lead on how we started working with the Bangladeshi community. Like I said, there's such a majority of our clients are of Bangladeshi origin, first, second, third generation, whichever, that we couldn't avoid it, with 75% of our clients coming through, and a number of them not being able to work in English. So, we couldn't do loads and loads of work with interpreters. It's never as effective. And the way that we did it was we first of all had somebody with the project who was very involved within community organising. And we got involved with the mosque and the Muslim Women's Centre. And and as time's gone on, it's been a matter of finding people within the Bangladeshi community like Dilshana and Ranu, who are wonderful workers from within the community. And that's, I think that, actually we've also, when we were putting together our program, we've brought in imams to advise us, particularly around issues like sex and Islam. There's a great imam from Bradford who used to do a radio show called The Joy of Muslim Sex, that was who was very able to talk really frankly to us about how to adapt things like the sexual respect bits of the program. So I don't know.
Thank you, Kate. Stephen?
Well, I suppose there's a couple of things in parallel. We had a very persistent Polish children and family social worker who repeatedly tried, despite being told it wasn't appropriate, to refer Polish women to our mainstream voluntary service. And the only route into that service is if the men were engaging. But she was saying, there's a big problem in the Polish community. So there was a lot of, we got a lot of pressure from that point of view. And also from her and other children and families, we were aware that they were just not engaging well with Polish families. At the same time, the police were pointing out that the second biggest group of domestic abuse offenders in Edinburgh after white Scottish men were Polish men, and that there were higher than average levels of violence involved as well. So they were very concerned about it. So looking at that, we thought there was absolutely a need for the service. We had a very short turnaround in terms of funding bids that were been put out by the Scottish Government. So we did put in a bid, but part of it was really about doing the research to see what was required. And what I would say is that we made contacts with like the Polish church, like Polish priests at the Catholic Cathedral in Edinburgh. But what really ramped up the engagement and our understanding of what was required was when we had Polish-speaking workers who could go out and do that work instead. We weren't sure what the service was going to look like. We had no preconceptions, but actually what was needed was pretty much the same as we were delivering in our mainstream service. So a perpetrator program plus support and safety planning services for their partners. So actually the model ended up being exactly the same as the mainstream model.
Thank you, Stephen. And to my PCS colleagues, would you say that was a similar, if you like, push that, and by push I mean in terms of the overrepresentation of domestic violence perpetrated from men from a Bangladeshi background, and how does that feature in relation to children's social care?
I don't know whether Dilshana and Rani want to say more, but there is, we showed that world map, and unlike for the Polish presenters here, in South Asian countries, there are high levels of domestic abuse. And I think, we also have, as I say, high levels of a South Asian population. So in some ways, it's just not surprising that we do have, large numbers of Bengali families within children's social care where we are. Dilsh.
Yeah, absolutely, Kate. I agree with Kate in terms of where we are set and the families we're working with. It was quite a natural thing to do, to work with the families who have this issue. And as Kate said, in terms of understanding about domestic violence or the cultural differences between two of the countries, it was important to actually understand what ideas and perceptions the men were coming with, and understand them from the cultural perspective as well. So it was just for me, myself, it was thing to be able to talk from a cultural perspective about and a linguistic perspective at domestic violence.
I think there's a real issue that if men come into a largely white British group, and it's very easy for a Bangladeshi man just to think that they're just trying to sell me Western values. This has nothing to do with me, and to be very rejecting of it on that basis.
Thank you. Another question for PCS. You mentioned a few times younger Bangladeshi men marrying younger British women. Could you tell us a bit more about this? Is there a correlation with increased domestic violence? And that question's from Alexandra Pounds.
I think one of the things we mentioned was younger Bangladeshi men marrying older British women, and the reason why we spoke about that was there was to do with in Bangladeshi community, it's not the norm. It's not seen as the normal thing to marry a divorcee or a woman older than the young man. But when we've noticed at times when it comes to the British citizenship thing comes in, moving to a better life, better way of life, younger men would choose and accept a woman who is older than himself, or with children as well, and that's where the situation becomes quite difficult to manage, as we were talking at that the cultural differences.
Yeah, I think adding to that, in a simple answer, yes, there is a correlation in terms of increased domestic violence, because there are a couple of strands there. So intention of marriage usually is a strand, because usually the younger man who is wishing to marry an older woman with children who may have been previously married may have the intention of marrying her for immigration purposes, okay? And then also the other strand is that she may have children from a previous marriage, so he's expected to play a father figure, a parenting role, which is he may not be able to have the skill sets to do so. That contributes to that as well. And the fact that the victim is unlikely to speak out if there is domestic violence in a second marriage, purely because of the shame and the stigma, and the fact that she might feel that is she will be blamed by everybody. So there's lots of different factors that play within a setting as such as that. So there is that correlation, yeah.
Yeah,
thank you. I'm going to have to move us on just because of time. So, question to Stephen and Ania. As you mentioned, isolation and Brexit. Do you think the rise in xenophobia, which in some cases has been aimed at Polish communities, has impacted levels of DV and people accessing services? This question is posed by Lorna.
I'm not sure, Ania, if you want to say something. I mean, I'm happy to say something about that, which is straightforwardly, I don't know. I'm really not sure. What has certainly been the case is we have had quite a dip in terms of the referrals, and that's from court mandated men and voluntary men through COVID. But I think it is about COVID. It's about the fact that the courts we're not shut down, but we're operating at a very low level in terms of the number of cases. Most of our referrals for respite, as well as all our voluntary referrals, come with at least a push from children and family social work. So children have been probably seen face to face less. So I suspect that the dip has come from that. I don't know, Ania, if you want to say anything in terms of the xenophobia, which is clearly is around, and it has been increasing. But Ania.
So as Stephen mentioned, we don't really know because it's really difficult to take apart Brexit and COVID, which kind of happened at the same time. But in terms of my opinion and what I can observe within the Polish community is that Brexit is definitely a huge stressor factor. And as we all know, the stress would have an impact on the prevalence of domestic abuse within the families. So there's been a lot of misinformation around community and around what Brexit implications would have. And there is also limitations of movement, which is not necessarily such a big issue, but it becomes a change. And, it becomes unsettling for Polish communities. It becomes unsettling for Polish families. So I think that would have an impact on the prevalence of domestic abuse and domestic violence. And with regards to xenophobia, we are fairly fortunate within Edinburgh that we don't see this being a big issue amongst our community. But there is definitely perception of Polish families about how they're going to be seen by other members of community. So I'm unaware of any particular incidents of xenophobia, but I think people are becoming more and more aware of their immigration status and become just more aware of being out group members. And if there is already this distinction between the Polish community and other communities, it is making them kind of drifting them apart even more.
Thank you so much, Ania. Question to PCS. What are the key ways you engage men in the circumstances described? Kate?
Well, first of all, we sit within children's services. So we take all our referrals from children's social care. And it's a really, I don't know whether I'm answering the question. I'm not entirely sure how it's meant, but one of the key motivational factors for the men that we work with is about children and being a parent. They're not always exceptionally good at that, but it's an area where they tend to be very motivated. And I think it's important to recognize that if you've made an arranged marriage, you don't always have, like when you work with romantic love relationships, even if they're entirely loveless now, you can usually talk back to a point where there was love and respect. And with an arranged marriage, you can't always. It might be that there was never love and respect, and that there's a huge objectification of the woman. So yeah.
Thanks. We've got quite a few questions, so I'm gonna have to push through. Right. So thank you again, PCS, and I'll invite Ranu. You talk about younger people in the community wanting to distance themselves from some aspects of their culture. Is there any youth outreach being done within the community as a means of prevention?
I'm not sure what is meant by prevention, but in terms of so in town hamlets generally, there is a lot of provision for youngsters, and the mosques are a lot more modern in terms of their thinking, particularly one particular mosque. So it does provide other resources within the mosque to support youngsters who are struggling with identity, possibly maybe, but also who might want to find their own identity within as British Bangladeshi rather than Bangladeshi. And yes, schools are quite multicultural within town hamlets itself. So there are lots of provision within schools that they can set that. So it's not an isolated community in as such that, it's a small community that's trying to break away. There's layers of different identity within the Bangladeshi community in town hamlets. So you've got the first generation, second generation, and the third generation, but also and they're entwined. So it's not just about first generation trying to move away from their identity, their culture, and adapt more Western views. So there are different layers, and within those layers, there are different provisions that can be provided.
Thank you, Ranu. We're going to take another question from Colin. As an added strand, you have spoken about religion and culture being used as a way to excuse domestic violence. Do you ever encounter issues connected to Bangladeshi politics and political groups playing out amongst the population you work with? This is a question.
Shall I take that one? Yeah. I mean, not really in terms of politics. We don't tend to come across, and I don't think we ever come across a case that's politically led or politically agendaed. One of the things that would be prevalent or quite impacting would be if a perp held up really high position in terms of politics within Bangladesh. So it will create a lot more pressure for him to show to his community, to his country, that he's got his house in order, in a sense, you know, that he's able to manage his family. And if he can't manage his family, then it could be seen as how can he manage the country, or how can he make decisions for the country if he can't manage his own personal affairs. So that's the only strand I could see that would play out politically, which in a sense could be the same in other communities, other countries, because the higher positions, status they hold within their community, within their country, it makes it a lot more difficult for them to kind of reach out or change or ask for support.
Thank you, Ranu. Ania and Stephen, same question. Would you like me to repeat it, or are you okay?
Sorry, please, yes. I was engrossed in that answer.
All right. So this is just in relation to...
Oh, it was about political...
That's right.
I think as Ania's the person who's directly delivering the groups, you've got a better view on this. I'm not aware of it, but Ania, what would you say?
So we are saying a little bit of that, as sometimes men are emphasizing the differences between some of the politics and differences in terms of some of the kind of current climate. But this usually comes within the dynamic when men are comparing the two countries, and then when they're talking about, you know, their sentiment to living back in Poland, and the country that they live in at the moment, which is Scotland, is worse to some extent, and they're kind of bringing up those political differences at the time. However, we don't see that playing up too much, because first of all, that's something that is easy to challenge, as people have chosen to live in the different political climate, so they need to follow the kind of rules the country that they've chosen to live within. And also because we are Polish workers, it's also easier for us to challenge that, because we are up to date with everything that's going on. We are hearing that it plays about a little bit more when Polish families are engaging with workers and professionals from other nations, because this is when it can easier come into play and easily can be pulled as an excuse, where being Polish, working with Polish community, it's easier for us to challenge that, so it's not coming up so often.
Thank you, Ania.
Can I just quickly add that
Ranu, so we've got quite a few questions. What I'm going to ask is we try to respond to some of the questions we haven't been able to in the main chat. Yeah, we've got a couple more minutes, and I'm going to put what I consider to be the quick to answer questions to specific people. So, Kate, does Positive Change take referrals from other London boroughs? Ronnie?
Not at the moment. I'll just leave it at that for brevity.
Thank you. Not at the moment. Thank you. We are closely linked to children's social care in the London Borough that you work within, I assume. So another question, just one more. I don't know if we'll be able to get too much into this, but I'm going to push it. So PCS, you nicely pictured the role of the extended family, particularly the elderly. Given that, do you somehow involve such important family members in work with perpetrators to engage or create the support system for the behavioural change of a person using violence? And this comes from Dean.
Rani, would you talk about our FGC work?
Yes, I guess I can talk about that. Where it's safe to do so, we would use the family group conference service to engage with the extended family to become more upstanders rather than bystanders. So it will be about how we'll have specific questions we would ask the family group conference service to address with the family. And usually it will be around how can they hold the perpetrator accountable? And how can they support the victim, right? So without any blame in either. So in terms of that could be around parenting role, that could be around finance, that could be around when something's happened, who would be the person to report it, and who would they report it to? So creating some sort of safety network system within the family. So this, the idea is that it doesn't keep coming back to social care, that the family are able to be a safe, a set of network that can deal with the situation before it escalates.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work with the family group conference team, adjusting the model to make it safer for women, less blaming. And a lot is in the questions you ask the family to solve.
Mm.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.